So it's a special mukbang time.
This is a world.
This is a world premiere.
This is a world.
Hey, so y'all, welcome. It's a little mini mukbang. Got a little, I've got a blueberry smoothie. It's frozen blueberries and banana and coconut water, actually. So, and it's delicious. And I just wanted to kind of touch base with y'all. You know, I like to sit and just talk long form with you about what's going on with me. Yesterday, I went to a birthday party for Shane Bernardo, and I don't know if many of you are familiar with him. He is actually one of the folks who appeared in the film Cowspiracy. He's a really cool guy. He works with an organization called Earthworks Farms, and he's also one of the, he also works with an organization called the Day Project, and I believe that Detroit Asian Youth is what Day stands for. And yeah, he's a really amazing guy, and it was really funny because, you know, I think of myself in this one way because most of my life I've been a person in the theater, I've been running an organization, I've been a community organizer, but I don't really necessarily think of myself as a journalist. And so he was introducing me as, you know, for this, he was introducing me because of this work to other people, and I'm guessing that he's somehow engaging with this content. So you know, I want to thank Shane for you know, that support, and maybe we can get Shane to, you know, come on the channel and appear. So if you're interested in speaking to Shane Bernardo of Detroit Asian Youth, the Day Project, or Earthworks Farm, which is right, you know, just a couple of blocks from the alt space here, yeah, I'll reach out to him and see if he wants to come on the channel. Anyway, so thanks to everyone who responded to my last update. It was great to hear your opinions on the cleansing, and specifically Jesse Fruworth for all of your encouragement in terms of just eating, right? Just eating enough, right? Because that's something that can easily happen. And I can get very busy. I can not have enough food on the premises, especially in the winter. It's very, very difficult to get one's hands on fresh fruits and vegetables. And if you think Whole Foods is the answer, Whole Foods is not the answer. I went to Whole Foods and they did not have juicing oranges. So it's not like they're like the challenge for getting access to fresh fruits and vegetables is easy for anyone in the winter. Now imagine you don't have access or the resources to go to Whole Foods. Whole Foods is struggling. And, you know, I don't want to be defaming the character of Whole Foods, but they didn't have juicing oranges. They did not have juicing oranges. So, yeah, so I've taken a little bit of a turn in terms of, you know, how I've been just taking care of myself. And one thing that I realized, I have not been drinking enough water. So maybe part of my cleanse is simply consuming enough water. And oh my goodness, it's New Year's Eve. So tomorrow is January 1st. And I am not really a resolutions person. I am a person of resolve. So I make up my mind to do things and then I do them. And I don't really wait around for particular moments when it is more or less appropriate to be making resolutions. So if you are a New Year's resolution person, please do write down in the comment what some of your resolutions will be this year. And perhaps I'll share them. That's probably something I should have asked for, so then we could be sharing them tomorrow. But actually, there will be a live stream for those of you who catch this in time. I will be doing a New Year's 2017 live stream tomorrow. That will be Sunday, January 1st, 2017, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'm going to get into the thick of this talk. Today, I want to talk about, there's been a lot of the conversation about race has really picked up. And I'm sure that part of that has to do with the media. Taking my first turn here. When I hear conservatives talking about the liberal media, I want to laugh because my understanding as someone who might be considered a liberal, I am often horrified by the way the media presents images of certain people, helps to sensationalize, helps to create divisions. And so I think calling the media, the liberal media, is really not having a very thoughtful analysis of the way the media operates as one of the apparatuses of the maintenance of our current dominant ideologies in the United States, at least, and possibly in the rest of the world. I can't tell you how the media is used really in other parts of the world because I haven't spent significant amounts of time in other parts of the world. But certainly I understand that the media is a tool for the maintenance of a particular type of ideology. And although there may be things that come through in the media that make us feel like there are advances, make us feel like we're breaking through, please don't be fooled into thinking that the mainstream media will ever be anything other than a tool for the maintenance of the dominant ideologies. So that, I guess, brings me right to my like really the heart of this discussion, which has to do with the concept of the ruling class. Now, I don't even know for sure how the rest of the world, how most of the world, and particularly other citizens of the United States, feel, think about the concept of a ruling class. When the term ruling class is heard, do people understand it as a simple fact of life, or do people hear it as kind of a conspiracy theory about the way the world runs? And I want to pick this apart. Not that I've done any type of study about class or class warfare. I have done a fair amount of reading about class, particularly a book by Thorstein Veblen called The Theory of the Leisure Class, where he really explores from the beginning of time, and again, it's a theory, trying to understand why the leisure class has the concerns that they have as far as the way they move through the world. The way they move through the world. And combining this notion of the leisure class and really this idea that one wants to remove themselves by varying degrees from being a productive person to a consuming person. And the leisure class wants to only consume. That's the idea. And, before you think I'm being judgmental, I'm not being judgmental. That is why it is the leisure class. So, someone who's a member of the leisure class needs to feel a certain amount of security, a security that they won't ever need to produce or that they won't need to work. They want to spend in their entire lives at leisure. And at one point in the development of society, someone who was part of the leisure class would have maybe just had someone going and getting food for them and bringing it back. And then as it develops, it's not just that individual who wants to be non-productive. They want their family to be non-productive, and that family starts to extend over time until we have, entire dynasties that are leisure dynasties. And so, not to reduce that, and again, I'm not someone who's made really a study of the development of class over history, but have had some fascination, have done some reading, and do have somewhat of an understanding of the concerns of the leisure class. When you combine this idea of a leisure class with the idea of a ruling class, it becomes a fairly toxic combination. Now, I'm not sure if our current ruling class really even exist, right? This is what I'm here to talk about, here to question. Is there an existing ruling class in the world today? Is that ruling class having an impact on the lives of people in the United States? Again, this is the experience that I'm having. I'm a citizen of the United States. I can get ideas about what's happening in the rest of the world, but I don't really have a full understanding of the way laws and policies are formed and in other parts of the world. So as a citizen of the United States of America, do I believe that there is a class that is controlling our lives? And once determining that there is a class of people who are controlling our lives, and maybe evidenced by the way we see corporations having greater and greater influence over our policies and laws in the United States, it becomes easier to swallow the notion that there is a ruling class, even if they are just the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies. So once we determine or not that there is a ruling class, then my question is, are they, for the most part, benevolent and well-functioning and well-serving of the society over which they rule? Or are they, for the most part, malevolent and non-serving of the society over which they rule? So that's just a question that I had this morning. Is there a ruling class? And if there is a ruling class, are they doing a good job? Are they doing a good job? So I'd love to know what people think about that. And then, I've been doing this reading. I'm working on this devised theater piece on race, and most recently I've been reading, this is Theodore V. Allen's The Invention of the White Race. It's a 2-volume book. I've actually been reading it along with a presentation, and I will include a link to the presentation that I've been watching. It's a 2-hour presentation that walks through Allen's work. And I feel it's important now that we're in this, we're about to have a new president any day now in the United States, and people seem to be concerned about what that means in terms of the United States and our relationship with the concept of race. Now, that's not to speak of the actual relationships that exist between people of, so-called different races, but our relationship to the concept of race itself seems to be one that is fraught with problems. And so we might, as individuals, be able to exist in the same space and, not see race. But as soon as the subject of race is brought up, people who were, getting along just fine suddenly the relationship starts to break down. And I want to really go back to the origins of modern concepts of race in the United States in particular, as an English colony where we did have a ruling elite. If we don't believe that we have a ruling elite now, we certainly had a ruling elite at the founding of what would become the United States of America when this country was first settled in the early 17th century. I believe we get the first Constitution. We get, what is that? We get the first. We get the Virginia colony. I believe it's something like 1606. What have you? Their charter. That was the word that I was having trouble remembering. Sorry, you all. But we get the charter for, I believe, the Virginia Jamestown in 1606. Maybe is that the first? Is that the first chartered town in the United States? I don't know. But we have this colony, these colonies still under British rule, and the individuals that were sent to the United States were sent to the colonies, were sent with the purpose to extract wealth. To extract wealth. And Allen talks specifically about what was happening in England in the century and a half before you had the first settlers coming to the United States. And there was a population boom. There was overpopulation. You had the enclosures. You had people who had been living and making their, making their living from the land, that were being thrown off that land as it was becoming, private property. And we had the loss of this thing called the commons, which I can talk about in another video, but I'm really just kind of getting us to the United States. So you have overpopulation in England. And so we have a surplus of people who can be sent to these colonies to be the workers, to labor and extract this wealth that is then paid to the crown, or at least some part of it is taxed and benefits the crown. And so there is a version of the founding of the United States where basically the English, with their surplus population, could have simply settled in the New World and started a country. However, they ran into problems. We know that they didn't really understand how to survive in the American wilderness, in the wilds of the New World, and really depended a lot on the indigenous people to get through those first winters. However, they weren't here to make friends with those natives in the New World, and so the hostilities developed, and so you saw great loss of life of both Native Americans and colonists during those early years. And so it wasn't as easy for the British to get this country populated with their people. It's especially when the purpose of that population was to put them to work. They were being brought here to be a labor class who were ruled over by the landholders, which is a very small group of people. And so there was a need for additional labor, and slavery presented a solution. However, before we get into our knee-jerk, typical discussion of slavery, the English had been attempting to enslave their own poor for nearly 100 years. One would say at least 50 years. At least 50 years. Attempting to pass laws that would enslave the poor in England. I believe it was sometime in the 1550s, so it was more like 50 years before we have the first settlements in the United States. But once they arrived, there were still attempts on the part of the ruling class to enslave poor whites. They needed that labor to remain as cheap as possible, and they needed those relationships to be formed in a way that the workers could be exploited to the fullest. The problem was those laborers remained under English common law, and according to English common law, no Christian could ever be enslaved. And so when you suddenly had this labor force from Africa, which were purchased slaves, chattel slaves, we have liberties that can be taken with the treatment of others. However, attitudes about those slaves coming from Africa and the laborers who were being shipped from Europe weren't that different in terms of the ruling class. They were doing everything that they can, using every possible instrument to exploit those laborers to the fullest. And, the short version of the story is this culminates, doesn't necessarily come to an end here, but it comes to a head with Bacon's Rebellion, which happened in 1676 to 1677. There was an entire year where people who were of African descent and people who were of European descent fought against the ruling class. They burned down the major city. Jamestown was burned. They took over huge portions of land. It was a rebellion that may have seemed for a time was actually succeeding. And finally, the British had to send in troops to put that rebellion down. And it really isn't until after Bacon's Rebellion, which some will say started as initially it was they were formed and they moved against the Native Americans who were attacking the colonies, which was totally justifiable. But that rebellion very quickly took on a political tone and became about the abolition of bond servitude as it existed in the United States. And again, it was primarily people of European descent, because at that time, 3/4 of the bond service, 3/4 of the people in bond service were Europeans, were of European descent. And the African laborers were still at that time a minority of the bond laborers, slaves. So we basically, for all intents and purposes, had white and black slaves fighting to abolish slavery. And so, as a result, and I can't know for sure the causality one towards to the other. I don't know if that rebellion is what caused them to make the decision to move into this strategy, but apparently Allen worked from primary source material. And so a lot of that exists and is in the notes of his book. But it was clear that there needed to be a more solid mechanism for social control in the United States. And the mechanism for social control was to not elevate, but was to demote Africans in the society and privilege Europeans with what became known as white skin privilege. And what that meant was if you were not white, you had liberties taken away. And if you were white, you could rest assured in the privilege of these liberties, which in England, the poorest person was born with. But in the United States, that those liberties were conferred on Europeans in the form of something called whiteness, and it starts to appear in legal documents, this idea of white-skinned free. And so there is an historical moment when the working class in the United States was divided into white working class and non-whites. And non-whites included mulattoes, and that's quoting the language of those acts, and in Native Americans, who they called Indians. And so you have these divisions put in place, and then these divisions are codified in law. So it isn't simply a matter of not liking, people with white skin not liking suddenly people with darker skin or people of African descent. And sometimes it's so ridiculous because sometimes the person who was being considered white looked no different than the person who was of African descent, because by that time there had been all kinds of intermarriage between Europeans and Africans. They lived together, they worked together, they played together. There was a sense of solidarity, and that solidarity is what was destroyed in the formation of this group called White America. And so when we talk about whiteness, that's something else. How do people, do people hear that and think, well, that's not true, that's a conspiracy, that could never have worked? What are your thoughts about that? Understanding that there was an historical moment before which there was no one on the planet referred to as white. There was no white race. It was invented with the expressed purpose of creating a division between members of the working class. Interestingly, those poor Europeans who became the beneficiaries of whiteness saw very little change in their status. They saw very little change in their status. While on the other hand, laws were passed against Africans, mulattoes, and Indians, saying that if you raised a hand against any white person, you would receive 30 lashes. That Africans, mulattoes, Indians were not allowed to carry any type of weapon to be used offensively or defensively. So Africans, mulattoes, and Indians lost the ability to defend themselves. from this new privileged group called white. And so we are left 200 years later, a little more than 200 years later. It was 1723 when we saw those laws enacted, but those laws started to appear truthfully as early as the 1650s with the first anti-miscegenation laws. And so to understand that we lived in a society where for 200 years there were laws, there was propaganda to ensure that there would never be solidarity between European members of the working class and African members of the working class. Of course, at that time, there was a belief that Africans would always be enslaved, that no African would ever become a citizen of the United States. When the United States becomes a country and the naturalization laws were being created, it was set in those laws that in order to be a citizen of the United States, one had to be white. By then, white is in common use and is being used to reinforce divisions that exist between whites and blacks. And then we see, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, we see black codes put in place just again to ensure that there will never be solidarity between now whites and non-whites in the United States. And then we get one act in 1967 that is supposed to undo 250 years of propagandizing and laws and mechanisms that are being put in place to ensure the subjugation of all other races to this invented group called whites, into which other nationalities have been invited over time. The Irish were not automatically white. They became white once they got here. Italians came here and they weren't considered white until they became white when they came to the United States. And we see other groups moving fluidly in and out of this idea of whiteness. And so just this idea that it is something that is so flimsy, but it's held on to with such passion. And so when you hear people say things like, Black Lives Matter, it's almost, I don't want to say anything against the Black Lives Matter movement, but we're really missing the point. I don't know how to say this. I don't want to say, down with whiteness, because I don't want people to think that I'm talking about down with white people. But, what it seems is really necessary is for people to come to terms with the idea, if one believes, the history that's being presented, that whiteness was invented as a destructive force in our society. Whiteness was invented to prevent solidarity. Being African wasn't invented to prevent solidarity. Whiteness was invented to prevent solidarity. And if that is the case, what is the responsibility of white people? And it was a role that I'm sure at a time was looked upon by Europeans as the most ludicrous thing that they'd ever heard. But somehow, between the introduction of those early anti-Negro, anti-African laws, policies being put in place, and in their enforcement over 250 years, people got on board. People got on board to the point where lynchings were a community celebration. And you see the photos where you have women and children and picnic baskets and a burned corpse of an African. So people got on board. And so, how do people get off the boat? When was the choice made to stop accepting what came part and parcel with the identity of whiteness? Because that identity has only ever existed as a form of social control. To have an ally amongst the majority of the people who weren't necessarily benefiting materially, except that they were having conferred upon them rights that should have been, their natural born rights, whatever that means. Because whenever somebody talks about natural born rights, it sounds to me like a list that was put together by some European men. So, that's where I am today. And I hope I haven't gone on for too long, but as you can see, I'm all done. And so there's no need to go on. I hope that you have some thoughts about what I've been discussing with you today. I hope you have a fantastic evening, everyone, and enjoy your new year. Happy New Year. And hopefully some of you will be joining me for my live stream on YouNow at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's it for this video. Like it if you like it. Share, comment, subscribe. This is Reg signing off. Love yourself. Peace.
And I love myself. The world is a ghetto with big guns and dick inside.